and welcome to Illicit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Enrique Guerra, Instructor of Business Law at the University of Central Florida. We will discuss his draft article, Breaking Bad Promises. So welcome back to the show, Enrique.
Thank you for having me back. I've been on my best behavior.
The pleasure's all mine. As you know, I totally love this paper. I think it's funny, provocative, and really thoughtful at the same time. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you about it.
Thank you. It has been quite a paper, and I have to say something about just the behind the scenes of the paper. The funnest, one of the most enjoyable aspects of it has been really getting a lot of feedback. It's been striking a nerve, and I've been able to add some examples and think about the problem more deeply. So I've been enjoying myself with the paper.
Yeah, I can tell. So Enrique, for listeners who may not be that familiar with contract law or specifically with contract theory, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the promise principle and what it is.
That's a great question. The promise principle, really, it's the foundation of contracts. And it's the way I look at it, right? There's an overlap, but not a perfect overlap between the morality of making and breaking a promise and contract law. And the way contract law looks at it, right? There's a series of formal requirements or elements that have to be met in order for a promise to be legally enforceable. That is to say, in order for an agreement to actually be a contract with legal repercussions. And one of these elements, and by the way, I need to step back. The word promise principle. Big shout out to Charles Freed at Harvard. He wrote this beautiful book, one of my favorite contract theory books, Contract as Promise. And he really elaborates this promise principle. And that has just generated an entire legal literature. It's part of our legal contract lore as much as any classic common law case is. And one of the great things about Freed's work is just that he tries to unify all this body of contract common law cases. But I noticed there was a blind spot in the book, and it bothered me. And the blind spot was there's really not an in-depth, really no discussion of one of the essential elements of a contract, which is that the contract have a lawful purpose. And so this idea, and it seems to be very consistent with morality, almost a throwaway, right? That the contract, if the contract is inconsistent with public policy goals or certain conceptions of morality or the law itself. Think of the idea of a drug deal, right? That's just sort of the classic example of an unenforceable agreement. There may be an understanding between the participants of that type of a deal, but the courts are not going to really dirty their hands and enforce this. And so that's what I wanted to explore, this sort of underexplored, under-theorized area of what about promises that are not lawful, or even if they are lawful, maybe are inconsistent with certain moral norms. And so what I do in the paper that I think is useful and original is I'm defining or I create this concept of an illicit promise so that I can look at both illegal agreements and the illegal bargain doctrine of the common law, but I'm also fascinated by drug deals, by just immoral agreements, if you will.
Well, so maybe you could talk a little bit more about this distinction between illegal and immoral promises, like the sort of universe of illicit promises. What role, if any, does the promise principle or should the promise principle play in that context? And is it the same for all the different kinds of illicit promises?
That is an excellent question, and that is the paper in a nutshell. Once I do the deep dive and look at, and define deals or bargains or agreements that are either illegal or illicit, I create this sort of fourfold taxonomy of an illegal agreement that might be still consistent with morality. I should say I just visited Montgomery, Alabama, and I was at the Rosa Parks Museum. And one of the things that I didn't realize about the Rosa Parks incident, one of the great moments in American history. But after Parks was arrested for refusing to step to the back of the bus, the Black community in Montgomery, Alabama, created informally a carpool system. And that was a real series of, if you will, informal agreements that were motivated by a moral purpose, right, to protest second-class treatment, but that the local city officials, right, the segregationists, the racist officials deemed as an illegal agreement. And they actually went to the local courts to declare the carpool arrangement illegal. And so I look at all of these types of illicit promises, including classic illegal and immoral agreements, agreements that might be moral, but that contravene some law. A point that's not so esoteric, given the explosion of federal regulations and federal criminal legal liability. And so I go down that list. What really motivates me about looking at all of these types of agreements, and that would be a very long discussion. We wouldn't have time in this podcast, but is what's the unifying principle? And what bothered me or puzzled me, right, as a sort of looking at this with my scholar hat on, is there is what philosophers call an antinomy, and I'm calling a moral antinomy. And an antinomy is a special type of paradox where you have two statements that are logically true and logically coherent, but when you put them side by side, they create a friction. They are in tension or contradiction. And in my case, with this whole universe of illicit agreements, my concern is that, and let me fall back on the drug deal, right? That's sort of the classic paradigm case. With the drug deal, right? You could say the agreement is unlawful. We can even talk about the morality of the agreement providing, dangerous drugs. But at the same time, right? Well, let me put it this way. The promise principle would say that it would be wrong, morally speaking, and if you had a legally binding contract as well, legally speaking, it would be wrong to break a promise. But at the same time, the antinomy or paradox occurs in that if you break your promise, of course you're committing a wrongful act. But if the promise itself is to commit a wrongful act, right, keeping the promise will run afoul of moral principles, and in some cases, great legal consequences. And so that ultimately is what motivates the paper, right? How can we address this paradox of either I keep my promise and which is morally what I'm required to do in most instances, right? Generally speaking, but if the content of the promise itself is immoral, then I'm in a bind. What do I do?
And if I'm not mistaken, you refer to this as the Breaking Bad problem. I wonder if you could point to sort of the examples or kind of use some of the examples you use in the paper to illustrate the nature of the Breaking Bad problem kind of in practice or like in reality, and sort of what that tension looks like from a sort of concrete perspective.
Great. Thank you for asking that, because as you can see, sometimes abstract reasoning is never as powerful as actual examples. And in fact, the actual example that motivated the paper was when I saw the pilot episode of Breaking Bad for the first time. I actually came to the Breaking Bad party quite late. I try to stay away from TV so I can focus on my reading and writing and family obligations and things like that. But Breaking Bad, I was just mesmerized, as many people were. And that initial pilot episode, right, what it presents is a criminal partnership, right? You have Walter White, this ordinary high school chemistry teacher, but he's been diagnosed with a very severe form of cancer, fatal terminal disease, and his former student Jesse Pinkman, right, who's sort of a ne'er-do-well, small-time dealer. And the two join forces in a very odd way. Jesse's very skeptical of Walter White's decision to enter into the drug business, the meth trade in that particular series. But they do end up joining forces. And I wanted to explore that because, one of the things that's interesting about Breaking Bad, the series, is that Walter White's initial motivations could be described as good, right? He wants to provide for his family. Maybe it's misguided, but we have these, goes back to Antigone, right? We have these moral duties to our family, and but at the same time, he tries to further that interest, that moral interest of providing for his family by engaging in this very dangerous, illegal, and illicit deal, right, with his former student. And so you see the antinomy right then and there, right? Is Jesse Pinkman, and is he obligated then once he agrees, to buy an RV and to help teach the chemistry teacher, how the ingredients necessary to produce their illicit wares. And, it's fascinating, and I have to shout out Margaret Montoya here. And actually, even in the one of the episodes of Breaking Bad, I think it's called Black and Blue, if I'm not mistaken. No, Azul y Negro, it's in Spanish, blue and black. There's actually a narco corrido devoted to the Heisenberg character, who Walter White becomes. And Margaret Montoya had mentioned to me that there's actually a whole universe of Mexican Spanish ballads, narco corridos, that are singing, in some cases, yes, the praises of drug lords, but in other cases, singing about sort of the code, right, that gangsters and drug dealers have, that when they make a promise, regardless of the legality of their agreements, they sort of have a moral, a code of honor to keep their word. And so that really, it's just to me, I can't think of a more, well, there are other examples, but that's a very concrete example of this moral paradox, making a promise to do what is effectively something illegal or illicit or immoral. What do you do in that situation? You're Jesse Pinkman. What do you do? Once you agree to the promise, you are, what are your obligations?
I mean, it's one thing that has always struck me as kind of a weakness of traditional contract theory, especially in relation to promises, is this kind of background Puritanism of the sort of normative assumptions behind the theory fails to describe people's actually lived experience and how people do promising.
That's wonderful. I'm glad you mentioned it, because you're right. Of course, Stuart Macaulay, those who teach contracts, this idea of relational agreements and what business persons actually, how they actually make and enforce their agreements, and it really is much wider than that. But and you're right. This paper taps into that stream. What's fascinating about this is, when I began the paper, it really began as a small side project. It was going to be a very short, not a full length article. It was simply going to be, maybe even began as a blog post. Here's my contribution to the Breaking Bad literature. There's actually quite an extensive literature, moral philosophy, legal scholarship, all kinds of things, religion. I believe there's a course at Claremont McKenna College, all devoted to Breaking Bad. But then, your point is well taken about the Puritanism of our legal doctrine, because as I explored further, I just found these illicit promises everywhere you turn. And I'll give you some examples just from the recent news, and I'm debating whether to just mention them in the paper or build them out as full examples. But think of the college admission scandals of earlier this year. In fact, because some of the people indicted were celebrities, but all of them were very wealthy parents who, in essence, made these illicit agreements with a ringleader, right, to get their children into college. They would pay under the table, this, what the paper is trying to tap into that. I'm also thinking of these collusion allegations, much more controversial once we're in the impeachment terrain. But ultimately, the whole issue with Ukraine, right, and President Trump and his people is almost an attempted illicit promise. One can frame it that way. And in other words, this is much more. This could be more common, right? A lot of malfeasance could ultimately be in this domain. And what do we do about it?
Well, one thing that also struck me is that you're talking about illicit promises and how we ought to think about their enforceability. But it struck me that there are all number of licit promises that are still unenforceable as a legal matter, right? Like to have and to hold, right? I mean, the law doesn't enforce that, right? I'm going to love you till the day I die, right? I mean, that's not an enforceable promise. And yet, we still think that it's morally binding, right? Even though the law wouldn't recognize it as a contractual obligation.
That's why I went on this podcast. You just helped fill a blind spot I had in my paper. Going back to my fourfold taxonomy, right? If we look at two dimensions of promising, right, of the promise principle, the legality of the promise, just in a formal legal sense, is there some, law against bribery or something, or, a law classifying a substance as an illegal one? But also, the morality of a promise, right? And then we have various moral theories we could talk about to look at the moral content of a promise. But the fourfold classification would include promises that are, putting it in a very Pickwickian fashion, not illegal and not immoral, right? Legal and moral promises that shouldn't raise any issues. But that's a great example of one, right? It's not illegal to enter into a marriage vow, but that won't be, and in fact, probably that's the moral thing, right? To do to signal that seriousness of the commitment, but yet it won't be enforced. So like I say, I see these things everywhere now. I look.
Well, so maybe you could talk about some of the efforts people have made to try to solve this moral problem and why you think that these other efforts are not effective.
Brian, that is a great question, and thank you for asking, because, and I have to answer that question by describing two broad headings. Really, moral philosophers have attempted to address this conundrum, but so have legal theorists. And what moral philosophers have done, I won't spend much time there. I'm quite underwhelmed. They've taken one of two approaches: either to say that if a promise has an immoral content to it, then it's not a promise. So that's just an example of defining the problem away. Or there's a paper with a wonderful title called "Wicked Promises," and in that paper, a novel theory is proposed that no, an immoral promise is just as much a promise as a moral one, but immoral promises do not generate obligations on the promisor, on the person making the promise. And again, it doesn't address my concern, is that people, let's say in a drug deal, who make a set of illicit or immoral promises, or even illegal ones, might still feel themselves to be obligated to have to keep their word. And that's the phenomenon that I want to try to explain and understand. Now, on the other broad heading, legal theorists, I have to say that this is just a wonderful part of the contract literature. There are three really powerful theories have been championed as to explain the promise principle and how and when the promise principle kicks in. The three theories are broadly the will or autonomy theory of contracting or promising, the expectation theory, and the consequentialism theory of promising. And the will theory I'll discuss first, because we can connect that back to Charles Freed and his original work on the promise principle. For a lot of contract theorists, including Freed, it's a promise is a product of one's autonomy or free will, and so a promise becomes binding when one sincerely makes a promise. There are two blind spots, though, with this theory. It's a good theory, very intuitive, but the two blind spots, from my perspective, are one, I call reversibility. In other words, that, well, if my will is what makes a promise, then I can just undo a promise by having a equal reaction to that, an equal will to not make a promise or to undo a previous promise, and that can't be right. The whole purpose of the theory is to explain why promises are binding. But the other problem is, and perhaps even a deeper one, is that the will theory, it doesn't distinguish between or try to draw a distinction between moral and immoral promises, right? It's what matters is the intention of the promisor. This now takes us then to the expectation theory, and there's which is associated with another theorist, an English contract theorist, Patrick Ataya, and his theory actually is very powerful. A lot of common law cases about contracts can be explained with the expectation theory. The nutshell, the basic of the idea is that let's not focus on the promisor, let's focus on the promisee, the person receiving the promise. And if I make a promise and that generates an expectation in the promisee and the person receiving the promise, then that's when the promise principle should kick in. But again, we have the same blind spot. That is to say, we don't distinguish between the content, or this theory doesn't distinguish between the content, moral content or immoral content of a promise, and that could be problematic, right? That's what we want to explain: which promises are necessarily binding, even based on their status. Finally, this idea of a consequentialist theory. What we do there is and it does not do justice to summarize this in a few sentences, but the basic idea here is you look at sort of what are going to be the effects of keeping versus breaking a promise. This theory, and I say this in the paper, pun intended, is somewhat more promising in that, most likely immoral promises will generate bad consequences, whereas moral promises won't necessarily. And so that gives us some criterion, right, for distinguishing which promises the promise principle applies to. My problem there, though, and it's not really my problem, it's just the general critique of all utilitarian theory, is that consequentialism is forward-looking, right? We have to sort of guess and predict what the consequences will be. And I will say that, it can be concerning that an immoral promise, an immoral or illicit promise might actually produce good consequences. And so the consequentialist theory say, well, there's no problem. Then we have promise principle applies. And so what I do in the remainder of the paper is to try to figure out a solution. Try to figure out, can we, is there a third way? Is there a third way to look at this problem?
Yeah, I gotta say, especially, although I generally tend to be very sympathetic to consequentialism as a theory of justification, as a descriptive matter, it seems to totally miss the point of promise theory.
Right, and that's that's an excellent point, because it's illicit agreements do generate a concern, and ultimately we have this utility monster problem, right? That if Felicity Huffman, to use the example of the college admission scandals, she receives greater utility from her daughter getting admitted from based on an illicit agreement to pay off a proctor to fill in the right answers, then whereas my son, who's now applying for college, might get or I might get lower utility. Who's to judge that? The theory does break down. When you try to make it operationalize, and these are critiques that are out there. And what I end up doing in the paper? First, I have to confess, is when I began writing it, soon after seeing the pilot episode of Breaking Bad, I just thought the problem was insoluble. Right? It was just insoluble because there's just so many variables going on, especially once we're in the realm of morality, even law, right? Even defining what conduct is lawful or not can be challenging. But once we're in the domain of morality, where there are multiple theories of ethics. But what I ended up doing, just through discussions with colleagues and talking with various friends and colleagues, is I ended up proposing what I'm calling creating a common law framework or a common law approach. One of the interesting things of the common law is that it's actually, and I should say, when I began the paper, I actually scoured through all the moral philosophical literature just to see there's got to be some solution to this somewhere. When I didn't find a good solid solution, I kind of reverted back to the common law tradition, and it turns out common law is a very, very, very sophisticated body of law here. And one of the things that the common law does is distinguish between void and voidable promises. And here I want to shout out another colleague of mine, Daniel O'Gorman, who, although he didn't bring the distinction to my attention, he's done some work in this area. And I did some deeper thinking about this. And the idea is that maybe we can I'm inspired here by the common law to come up with an idea of voidable versus void promises, and trying to figure out when an illicit promise is merely voidable as to when it's void. Now, this sounds very technical, and I know when I was a law student, this was not my finest hour, distinguishing void and voidable agreements. But the basic idea is that a agreement is void. It's considered void ab initio from the outset. It's never a contract, never enforceable, no legal, theoretically, no moral consequences if we adopt this approach. Whereas voidable you sort of look at the context and you say, well, it might be there might be a greater injustice occurs if we don't enforce certain promises. The classic example here in a just in a legal scenario would be an unlicensed contractor. So an unlicensed contractor, technically, if those agreements, right, don't comply with the law if the contractor needs a license. But if the contractor does good work anyways and is charging a fair price, most courts will adopt a flexible approach and find a way of enforcing agreements with unlicensed contractors. Not always, of course, and so this idea of avoidable agreement, that the victim of the illicit promise or the illegal bargain, as the case may be, they have a choice as to whether to, okay, I'm going to comply with the agreement or not. And so I try to develop that theory in the last part of the paper.
Right. And if I understand it correctly, I mean, you sort of look at a kind of harm principle and ask what harm would result from enforcing or not enforcing the promise. Is that right?
Yes. And I have to say, somewhat sheepishly, that, the harm principle, it's a quagmire in and of itself, right? What is a harm? Fascinating just to the whole area of harm. But what I've done there is to sort of narrow it down and pin down. Yes, I'm taking a harm approach. And what I do here is, first of all, I say, okay, I need to limit myself to sort of take a common law approach. How does the common law define a harm? And generally, right, a harm is not just any setback to an interest. It's when there's an invasion of a legally protected right or a legal interest or a privilege or immunity, to borrow the Hofeldian, scheme. And so what I do is I say, okay, we need to figure out a way of distinguishing between justified and unjustified harms. And again, the common law, I think, does a very good job with the law of necessity, right? When you have this situation involving a tragic choice, oftentimes the law will excuse or justify the choice of a lesser evil. But I will say, right, distinguishing between a justified and unjustified harm, I will concede that can be a very difficult question. But if we can narrow down what harms are justified and which are unjustified, then we can. Then what I do is I look at the location of the harm and where does the harm fall. If the harm falls on a third party, somebody external to the contract, then I'm willing to say, this is void. Whether it's an illicit from an immoral point of view or from an illegal point of view, I want to know where that harm falls. And if the harm, however, is just localized, internal to the people making the promise, then I'm more comfortable saying it should be voidable. The parties themselves should decide. Now, I will say I still have to flesh this out. This is why this is a working paper or a draft. I may have opened up more, Pandora's box here by taking this approach. But I'm trying to sort of muddle my way through a framework so that we can at least look at, rather than define the problem away, maybe we can have a set of principles to create a more satisfactory solution to the problem.
Right. Well, so Enrique, in closing, I mean, I wonder if you could reflect on what the kind of broader goal of your project and the other people engaging in this field of study is. I mean, is the purpose to provide a descriptive theory of what people are doing and experiencing when they engage in promising, or is there necessarily a normative element in the sense that, we can't just describe the kind of internal sense of obligation, but also have to reflect on sort of the normative valence of promising in order to decide whether in fact a promise exists in the first place?
That is really an excellent question, and it's the $64 question, right? Like, why should anyone care about this? And I agree that both of those dimensions are important. And I'll put it this way: I'm always somewhat reluctant to enter into normative debates because I don't want to be the guy that says, look, all illicit promises have to fall by the wayside. I want to look at the logic of the people of making those illicit promises and try to explain that more from this descriptive point of view. But ultimately, I think there is a normative point here or normative aspect, because what I really care about here and why I think this is important is because why it's worth, usually this idea of an illicit or illegal bargain is sort of considered sort of an outlier. But I think it's a very important outlier because it should inform what the outer limits of the promise principle are, and I don't want to say that I have the final word on this, not by any means. I just want to propose a alternative framework and have others join this conversation with me and think about it with me. And the other thing, right, I think the larger project here is this uncertain relationship between law and ethics. The course that I teach, business law course, its formal title is Legal and Ethical Environment of Business. And so I'm always, I'm actually, to me, and I teach my course, I teach undergraduates. And so I like to teach business law as almost as a humanity, as a liberal arts course, and I'm really fascinated by, common law. We have the law of deceit, fraudulent misrepresentation. We have the law of contracts. We have the promise principle. There's a lot of overlay with ethics and morality. But that overlay, what's fascinating, right, is that it's not perfectly overlaid. In some cases, the overlay is a very small sliver. And so I think that's what I want this paper to be all about, to explore this overlay between law and morality in the context of promises.
Awesome. Well, it was a great paper. I really enjoyed it. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about it, Enrique.
No, thank you, Brian. And thank you for your wonderful podcast series and for making my commute such a joy now.
Año de 1900, al güero polvos mentados. Por la calle Guadalupe, en cantina de Simón, lo sacaron ya sin vida para llevarlo al panteón. El güero dijo a Simón, antes de hacerse la bola, te juro que solo muerto me quitarán mi pistola. Llegaron dos contestables, llegaron por mala suerte para poder desarmarlo. No seas así por ir. Los que quieran desarmarme, pues me tendrán que matar. Nada más con un disparo, el güero quedó tirado. Allí acabó con su vida el güero polvos mentados. Simón, este anillo es para ti, quítamelo de mí. A su nombre, González su apelativo, desde vivo y muy valiente, de San Antonio nativo.